Hey, I recently saw a really great video from a Marvel Snap creator that goes by Regis. Regis has always wowed me with his really awesome thumbnails for his videos. They often feature mashups of Marvel characters and different recolors and stuff like that, and he clearly has a passion for this. He recently put out a video showing how he does these thumbnails. It's really cool. I suggest you go watch it. I'll put a link in the description. And in it, he says this.
You know, I am not a traditionally trained graphic designer, so any graphic designers out there are probably going to get mad at me for the way I do things. It's just little things I've learned over time, my own way, my own process.
First of all, no way should anyone get mad at you for doing things the way that you do them. If the results are as good as this, then that's all that matters. But I wanted to make this video because I want to build on the foundation that Regis has laid in this video. I wanted to try my hand at making my own thumbnail while showing some additional methods for how to work on this very specific subject in Photoshop. And you may be wondering who I am. My name is Kevin. I'm a product designer. I've worked at companies like Discord and Cloudflare in the past decade. In my earlier years of my career, I was a graphic designer, so I have spent a lot of time working in Photoshop. I'm also a big Marvel Snap fan, so this is a good combination for me. But enough about me. Let's get started. Regis's video shows him combining She-Hulk and Red Hulk by recoloring She-Hulk's skin and clothing, adding some extra elements, and then adjusting the rest of the thumbnail's text and images. I just want to build atop this video by doing those same things, but touching on these 5 extremely useful and awesome features of Photoshop. 1, linked and embedded files. 2, masking. 3, adjustment layers. 4, blend modes. And 5, layer styles. This is just 5 of a million other things I could talk about, but I think these are really powerful features that can make your workflow a lot better. Let's take a look. Before I get to these though, I want you to understand a concept that once fully grasped, you'll feel like you have a Photoshop superpower. It's called non-destructive image editing. It wasn't always the case in the past, but nowadays 90% of the editing you do in Photoshop can be done non-destructively, meaning that you do not edit the underlying art at all. You instead layer adjustments and filters and maps on top of it. And that way you can always go back and readjust something without worry. If that sounds confusing, perhaps the following techniques will help it come into focus. So I'm going to show you a couple ways to make a Marvel Snap YouTube thumbnail in Regis' style, only using 6 layers. Technically. For my examples, I'm using a couple of Dan Hip variants. He's my favorite artist in Marvel Snap. So let's pretend I'm making a thumbnail for some kind of ongoing deck that got buffed with Armor and Atuma and Spectrum and Cosmo and Captain America art. I don't know, bear with me here. But you can see in the layers panel here that I only have 6 layers. A background, 2 cards inside of a group, this burst art behind the text, the title, and these 2 things are in a group as well, and the character. You may notice that each of these layers, except for a couple of them, have a little file icon on it. This is because each of these layers is a smart object. A smart object in Photoshop is a layer that contains image data from another file. Smart objects preserve an image's source content with all of its original characteristics, enabling you to perform non-destructive editing to the layer. So smart objects can be linked, meaning they live somewhere on your computer and can be edited outside of the file it's used within, or they can be embedded, meaning they only exist within this file. While both types are valid and useful, I'm using embedded ones here in this file. This will increase the file size, make the main file about 200 megabytes, but that's okay. So let me show you how you add a smart object. I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to go to File, Place Embedded, and I will add this file of some art I downloaded from Marvel Snap Zone. I can move it around, I can resize it. And there you go. So let's open it up by double clicking it. We have it all right here. I can make some edits with the brush perhaps. And you can see that back on the file that I originally have, it's not reflected yet. So if I save this, it will show up where it's embedded. Because this is an embedded smart object, it will not affect the original that I used. If it were linked though, it would. Also, one of the issues with linked smart objects is if you move them around, they can break the links, so you'll have to repair them once in a while. One of the cool things you can do with smart objects is replace the contents. So perhaps I've made a template with these two cards like I have here. I can go and select that layer. I can right click it. I can go to replace contents. And I can change it to perhaps the regular variant of armor. So this is a really easy way to switch in and out files in the same spot using the same kind of like parameters. So if I did that on this file, I could have this be my template, and I could switch out the art for each of the cards if I maybe downloaded all of the art and I just wanted to quickly change them. These have all been pretty simple ones. They all have just, the art in them. But let's take a look at this character layer. You can see that it's just a simple layer right here. Turn on, off, and on. But if I double click it, it is its own file with lots of layers in it. So as you can see, within this one, there are even more smart objects layered inside of it. So I have Captain America and Cosmo, as well as the original Spectrum art. If I double click Captain America, it'll open another one. If I make changes to this and save it, it'll be reflected there. You can keep your layers panels pretty tidy while retaining all of the art that you need without having to save all kinds of different, extraneous files to keep your different compositions. And it allows you to also make edits to, sub-compositions without having to think about the whole thing. Let's move on to masking. Masking in Photoshop is a technique that allows you to hide or reveal parts of an image without permanently deleting them. It's like applying a stencil over your picture. The areas covered by the mask are hidden, and the areas that show through remain visible. This provides a non-destructive way to edit your images so that you don't lose any of the art that you want to hide for a little while. In Regis's video, what he tends to do is select the art and then make a copy of the art onto another layer. As you can see here, he copied the skin from She-Hulk. That's a great way to not be destructive. His original art is still here in layer 1. But however, any changes he makes to layer 3 here, the skin that he copied, will now be permanent, meaning that he can't go back and undo what he did if he goes too far. There's lots of ways to make a mask, but I'll show you a couple. There's the lasso, the polygonal lasso, which is my personal favorite, the marquee tool, all kinds of other tools in the Photoshop toolbox. I'll show you one way to do it. So back here in Photoshop, I have Spectrum. So I don't have pre-extracted images like Regis does, so I need to mask out this background. And one way I can do that very quickly is by using the object selection tool. Photoshop very smartly can detect objects and it breaks them down. So I see that it kind of sees 3 things here, which are her hands and her body. If I click and then shift click and then shift click again, I should have most of the art. It looks pretty good. So now all I need to do once I have the selection is make sure I have the right layer selected and then hit this button down here, layer mask. You can see now that everything around is transparent. What I can do is Option or Alt click on the mask to see the black and white mask. And you can see that there's a little bit of a little spot between these sections that I selected. So I can take the brush, pick a normal brush instead of this one, and paint a little bit of white just to solve that issue. And we'll have a pretty good mask. And Photoshop does a really good job of knowing what it is you want to select these days. Back in the day, you just had to do it by hand. There will be times where you can't use the fancy selection tools like this, and I'll show you that a little later. But if I hit Alt again, that'll take me, Alt click or Option click, it'll take me back to the art. And then Shift click allows me to turn the mask on and off if I want. Yeah. So if I create a new layer, I can copy the mask by, again, Option or Alt clicking and dragging the mask onto the new layer. Okay. And then one more thing you're going to want to know about layer masks is this little chain icon here represents a movement link between the two. So if I use a tool to move this art around, the mask will go with it. However, if I click this and I move the art around, the mask will stay in place. And likewise, I can do the same with the mask. So most of the time you're going to want to keep the mask linked, but there are times where you don't. If I am doing two adjustments to something that have kind of the same mask, I might want to link layers together. So you can do the same thing here by selecting both of these layers by shift clicking and then clicking this little link icon. They'll have an icon here. And then when I move it around, everything shall move together. I'll undo that. And there's one more way to have things kind of linked together and move as a group, and that is to create a group, put your layers in it, and then you can move the the group. And then lastly, you can actually mask a group. So it could be that I just don't need any of these layer masks, and I can delete them. And the whole group takes care of the masking for me. While masking is a great way to cut out the background, something non-destructively, we'll move now onto adjustment layers, which will make amazing use of these masks. In Regis's video, you'll see that he repeatedly opens up adjustments from the image menu, trying to get She-Hulk's skin to be red. This eventually works, but it seems a little frustrating for him, a little bit. And the problem with this technique is every time you do an adjustment like this, you lock in the pixels and have a new starting point for each time you do a new adjustment. One way to level this up a bit, though, is by using adjustment layers. Adjustment layers in Photoshop are special layers that modify the layers beneath them. They, like masks, again, provide a non-destructive way of image editing. It means the original image remains unchanged and stays the same colors, same contrast, same luminosity, all of that. You can adjust this stuff, whenever you want. You can turn them on and off to return the original look. Makes it super flexible and super powerful. So let's go back to Photoshop, and I'll open up my spectrum art. So let's take a look over here. We have lots of adjustment layers that I've applied to this spectrum art. I'll turn off these ones and show you the hue and saturation one that I have here. So this one is just an adjustment layer that changes the hue 77 degrees. You can create an adjustment layer by clicking on this button here and go into the type of adjustment you want to make. So that'll make a new adjustment layer with a mask. You can kind of, replace the mask if you want. So I can do that, hide this one, and show you what it looks like as I adjust her jacket color. And this one, so I have jacket color change. This one right here is masking her pants, and it just desaturates. So I have multiple hue and saturation adjustments doing different things to different parts of the art. And in reality, the art remains unchanged underneath. This next one is curves, and curves manages the level of light and dark. And what I typically do here is you take this middle point, you drag it out, so that lifts up the mid values and leaves the low, the shadows and the brights where they are, so they stay a nice contrast. And then these last two I'll get into later. But there's lots of different things you can do with adjustment layers. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is that adjustment layers, while they affect everything below them, they can be changed so that they only affect one layer. So if you hit this button while it's selected, that'll put a little arrow and clip it to the art below it. So this hue and saturation thing will only affect the spectrum art. Most of the time, like if you're using masks the way I do, you won't need that, but it's a useful feature. So like I said, these last two layers here are for different adjustments to her jacket, because I wasn't super happy with how this blue came out. I wanted it to look like Blue Marvel's clothing, and it just kind of looked off. So there's other ways to do it, and I left this layer here in case, I wanted to keep it. So let's turn it off, and then I can turn on this color fill. This is just a solid color that has a similar mask of just the jacket. And normally this would actually just look like a solid blue, and that's pretty useless in this case. But through our fourth technique is blending modes, we can do something really cool with this. So Blending modes in Photoshop are kind of they're incredibly powerful. They're also pretty confusing. There's 27 of them. They're broken up into normal, darken, lighten, contrast, comparison, and composition, I believe. Composite categories. And most of the time you'll stick with like about 5 of them. I like normal, darken, multiply, lighten, screen, overlay, soft and hard light. And then this last one that I'm using down here is color, which takes the hue and the saturation of the color you've set in this fill and applies it on top of the luminosity of the base layer. So instead of just a solid color when it's on the normal blending mode, if I change it to color, it'll take the value of the jacket below it, and it ends up doing a really good job of colorizing things the way I want it, because I took this color straight from some art of Blue Marvel. Another way to do that is with a gradient map. This is very similar, especially if you do the color blending mode, but what it does is it maps the darks and the lights to the gradient that you set. So in this case, I've set just 2 colors, and it gives a little bit more of if you compare how they look, a little bit more of a contrast, because there's 2 kinds of blue. This blue maps with the darkest colors, and this blue maps with the lightest ones. So I encourage you to play with blending modes. 20 years after I've started using Photoshop, I still don't know what half of these mean, and they're mostly useless, but a lot of the time you'll come up with something pretty useful. All right, last topic, layer styles. Layer styles in Photoshop are special effects that can be applied quickly to individual layers in a project. They're completely customizable. You can stack them. You can save them for later use. Layer styles are added to layers by clicking this little button down here, and then you select the style that you want to apply, and a window will pop up, allowing you to edit that style, and you can also stack more by adding them here. Most of the time it'll show up with a bunch of default ones. You can see here that I've actually added layer styles to a lot of the layers here. So I have a drop shadow that I've added to each of the cards. I have a color overlay on the burst, and I have a lot of layer styles added to the title. So let's take a look at this one. By double clicking it, you can kind of see a preview of how it works. Without this layer style, by the way, this is just white text. If I turn it back on, you can see all the different things I've got here. I've got a bevel and an emboss, a stroke, that is a gradient, an inner glow, a gradient overlay, and a drop shadow. So if I turn each of these things on and off individually, you can see that they kind of stack up to make a pretty cool effect. The best part about this is this text is completely editable. I don't have to do anything special over and over again to make this work. I can just keep this layer style, and I've actually saved it so that whenever I make new text, I can just click this button and it'll add it to the layer. One last cool thing about layer styles is that you can Option or Alt click and drag onto another layer to quickly copy those effects. I don't really like how this looks, so I'm going to take that off. And there you have it. I don't think my thumbnail works quite as well as Regis's do, but I hope you learned something along the way. There's one more thing that I forgot that will make this a true YouTuber thumbnail. There we go. Much better.